On the first truly cold morning, the iron kettle breathed like a small animal. The windows sketched their own weather on the inside, a lace you could wipe away with a sleeve. I learned the angle of my hands for lighting the stove without scaring the match. I pulled the winter coat from the peg and marveled, again, that it still remembered my shoulders. People kept coming with things to mend and news to trade. They left with seams that held and tea that had argue left in it. I started to sleep the way cabins like, early and honest, with a window cracked just enough to let the pine in. A letter arrived from the company that made the blue kettle, offering a discount for loyalty. I laughed and set it under the iron one like a truce. The original kettle stayed on the shelf over the stove, its enamel nicked, and its handle polished by years of being kneaded. I don't keep it there because I worship objects. I keep it there because it stayed itself when the river tried to teach me otherwise. The green tin sits beside it, empty for the first time in 50 years, the brass key framed in a cheap shadow box that looks more expensive because of what it holds. When people ask about it, I tell them it's not luck. It's stubbornness with a sense of humor. On a Sunday that wore its light just right, Larissa came early with muffins and the particular smile she saves for sentences she isn't afraid of anymore. "We're not trying for a while," she said, dropping the attempt at apology. "We're going to be married people who like each other on purpose." I poured tea and said I was glad. She looked around the porch and said, "This place made me want that." Miguel arrived with a small sign he'd carved from cedar, the steam house. I argued and then hung it straight. Neighbors laughed and said it fit. Winter came anyway, as it does. Snow made the trailhead quiet and the porch creak under a new kind of weight. We put a rug by the door and a box of spare gloves under the bench, and a rule on the wall that said, in my mother's words, "Wipe your feet, but bring your story in." The iron kettle puffed. The blue one watched. The shed kept tools in order. The rocking chair understood the speed our conversations needed. If a plow shoved a ridge of snow across the lane, someone texted before I thought to ask. The development company sent a holiday card with a photograph of the curved trail under frost and a handwritten line that said, "Thanks for the curve." I stuck it on the fridge as evidence that paper can behave. I used to think survival was the end of a story. Now I know it's the beginning, people forget to film. Survival is the part where you make lists and hanglines and say no without explanations that leak. It's the part where you sign your name in ink, you brought in your own pocket. It's the part where you learn the sound a house makes when it chooses you back. I wake early. I put on the kettle. Some mornings I use the blue enamel because it's good to remind your hands who they are. Some mornings I use the iron because winter likes a partner. I stand in the doorway while the steam finds the glass and I say thank you in a voice too soft to need an answer. Then I sweep the porch, check the hinge, read the list, and open the door for whoever knocks with something torn and the hope of leaving whole. If you stayed with me to the end, tell me your city. I like to imagine the steam lifting just enough to reach your window and promise that ruin is only the clearing where you learn how to build a life that fits. We walked the path to the creek and let the water talk first. "I don't want to be in the middle between you and him," she said. "You won't be," I answered. "You're not a bridge. You're a person." She nodded in that slow way that means a thought has found a shelf. "Can we come on Sundays anyway? Even if we don't know what we're doing with anything else?" "Yes," I said. "Bring your notepad. I'll bring the seam ripper." On the way back, she touched the porch post the way you touch a shoulder you are getting to know again. She left before dark because she prefers the edges of the day to be clear. When the silence settled, it was a good one, like a room holding air after laughter. Miguel arrived an hour later with something that looked like a plan and smelled like cut wood. He'd drawn a list for a small shed out back, tools, a bench, a place to put what doesn't belong in the kitchen. "You don't have to live out of a trunk anymore," he said. We measured the footprint together under a sky that had decided to trust us. At the last stake, he hesitated as if searching for a different measurement. "You know I'm not here to rescue you," he said. "I know," I answered. "You're here to build with me." He smiled without showing teeth, which is how men smile when they mean it. We set the first post square the next morning. It stood like it had chosen the job. By the time the shed had walls, the cabin had rhythms. Monday was phone calls, Tuesday was errands, Wednesday belonged to the porch, Thursday to mending, Friday to anything that had fallen off the list. The kettle had become the metronome and the reward. I started leaving a hand-lettered sign at the end of the lane on Saturdays. Seam and steam, mending while you wait, tea on the porch. I charged what I needed to and no more. People brought jeans and curtains and stories. Some paid in cash. Some paid in apples or nails or a promise to come to the county meeting next month. I learned the names of their dogs and their late husbands and the creeks that run when it rains right. The porch learned the weight of other people's elbows. One afternoon, Diogo came with a rolled blueprint and a peace offering I hadn't known I wanted, a dozen clothespins and a line he'd threaded through a pair of eye hooks. Parking layout, he said, unrolling the paper with care, for the trailhead they insist on. It curves around your lane. 2 spaces only, a sign that says no through access. I'll make sure the sign faces the right way. He glanced at the kettle. Tea? He asked, awkward but attempting. We stood on the porch like colleagues learning the same language. I made it hard for her, he said, eyes on the line he'd drawn. I made it hard for you. Sometimes systems can be softer, I said. He nodded, as if softness were a new tool he could try on a Saturday. The insurance settled for enough to pay down what I owed and buy a mattress that didn't remember strangers. The county stamped my quiet title and mailed back the papers with a note from the clerk. Nice job. I put the letter in the folder marked Keep and the certified envelope in the one called Don't Try Me Again. On Sunday, Larissa came with a bag of herbs and a question she asked without decorating. Do you like him? It took a second to find the right him. Miguel? I asked. She nodded. I like building with him, I said. If I like more than that, I'll tell you after I tell myself. She laughed, the kind that doesn't put anyone on trial. We planted basil in a tin that once held cookies and now had the honor of making the porch smell like July. In the evening, the rocking chair took me back and forth in a private language. I thought the hard part had finished asking for attention. The phone rang. The development company had redrawn the map and wanted signatures to finalize. We're offering a small stipend for cooperation, the woman said, like she was sliding a coaster under a glass. You can keep your porch. We just need a corner of your lower lot for drainage. I looked at the place she meant with my mind's eye and saw the creek in a storm. No, I said. Curve elsewhere. She inhaled sharply and exhaled customer service. We'll adjust. When I hung up, I realized I'd answered in a voice that didn't need backup. The shed finished in a day that tasted like sawdust and relief. Miguel hung a pegboard and labeled hooks with a carpenter's handwriting. We slid Harold's old toolbox onto a shelf, the metal squeak sounding like a man satisfied after a long drive. Miguel ran his palm along the bench he'd planed himself and said, You could teach a class here. Mending, chair glue, how to talk to paper. The idea flashed through me like a bird you hear before you see. A class would bring people who wanted to learn repair, not just buy it. It would give the porch a job even in winter. We'll try, I said, and the words felt like a key I hadn't known I carried. We made flyers at the library. Mend and make do. Bring something torn. Leave with it whole. Tea provided. I taped them where people wait. The laundromat, the post office, the clinic that replaces knees. The first Saturday, 3 women and a teenager showed up with a coat lining, a backpack seam, and a chair that had forgotten its courage. We worked and we talked and the kettle sang. When someone asked how much, I said, Pay what it's worth to you and what you can. They brought money and cinnamon rolls and an offer from a man who knows gutters. Community is a form of currency. It spends well, Larissa began to arrive on Sundays with a planner that held fewer battles and more lists labeled later. She cried once, without apology, and said she didn't know what would happen next in the chapter about babies. I poured tea and told her the truth I had earned the slow way. We are not less ourselves when plans change shape. She leaned her head on my shoulder the way she did when she was 6 and afraid of thunder. Diogo came the following week with 2 folding chairs and a joke that admitted he'd been careful when it wasn't required. I can learn, he said. Everyone says that. The difference is the ones who do. He stayed and helped fix a neighbor's leaky gutter and left with a bag of basil. That counted. Miguel and I took the rocking chair into town for a small market and put a tag on it that said, Not for sale, please sit. People did. Some swung their feet and told stories about houses that aren't there anymore. Some closed their eyes for a minute because the motion borrowed a calmer hour and brought it back. A woman asked if I could fix her mother's chair same way. I said yes and heard my voice find a fuller room. Summer gathered around us like a shawl. The trailhead opened with 2 spaces and a sign that faced the right way. The dotted line curved away from my steps and found a polite route through scrub that didn't mind attention. The company man showed up at the ribbon cutting with a grin and a sentence I appreciated more than I expected. "Thanks for making this better." The county clerk came and brought cookies, because some people act like neighbors even when they wear badges. Harris the surveyor nodded once like a man whose lines held. The judge ran past in shorts and waved without remembering why he knew me. We laughed and we ate the clerk's cookies, and I went home to my porch and set the kettle to boil for whoever would arrive at dusk. When the kettle clicked, Larissa texted a picture. A negative test with the caption, "We'll try again when we want to." The sentence had no panic in it. I put the phone down and let the relief be small and sufficient. In early fall, I recorded the quiet title at the county, paid the taxes that were due, and slipped the stamped receipt into the folder with the tidy kind of satisfaction that glows without showing off. The insurance company sent a final check with an apology printed by a machine. I deposited it and bought a second-hand wood stove kettle just for winter, the iron kind that puffs when it's pleased. Miguel found me a storm door that fit with a little persuasion and exactly 2 new screws. We planted garlic in a row so straight even my mother would have nodded. Larissa started coming on Wednesdays just to sit. Once she brought a book and didn't open it. Once she brought nothing and said that was the point. One evening, she asked if I missed my old house. "I miss the groove on the porch where I dragged the chair every spring," I said. "I miss the spot in the yard where the tomatoes believed they could be better than last year. I don't miss paying for a story that ended." She nodded like she was taking notes she could use later. Diogo arrived with a bundle of kindling and the wariness of a man with a reputation to change. He sat in the not-for-sale chair and didn't ask what it cost to be forgiven. His eyes softened when the kettle sang. He said, "This sounds like a house," and I said, "It is." Miguel showed up one morning with a ladder and a coil of rope, and we walked the roof line together, me steadying the base while he cleared the last of the needle traps. Clouds were gathering over the ridge in the color of unmade decisions. He glanced at the sky and said we'd get rain by evening. I told him I was tired of flinching at the sound of water. "Then let it rain," he said, tying off the rope. "We'll listen and see what needs fixing." The first drops came like a rehearsal. By dusk, the cabin was wrapped in sound. The door swelled just enough to complain when I checked the latch. The kettle sang like it always has, and we ate soup that tasted better because it steamed the windows. Larissa texted she'd try to make it Sunday, if the roads behave. I set my phone face down and tried to believe roads could be taught manners. At midnight, the power hiccuped and went out. The room remembered the old ways. I lit the lamp and was grateful I'd learned the 10-minute rule for moths. Wind leaned on the trees, but not hard enough to make them confess. I put on my coat and stepped onto the porch to listen. Down the slope, the creek had found a bigger voice. A light flashed on the road, then another, then a horn quick with urgency. I headed down with my flashlight and the old winter boots that liked to be useful. A sedan sat crosswise in the ditch, 2 wheels spinning in place, a young couple standing beside it, soaked and startled but unhurt. "We're fine," the woman said, which is what frightened people say before they're sure. I called Miguel. He answered on the second ring and said he was already putting on his jacket. We worked in the rain the way people do when the problem isn't deciding but doing. A toe strap, a careful throttle, 2 deep breaths. The sedan climbed back to the road like a cow up a muddy bank. The couple thanked us too many times and drove off with both hands tight on the wheel. Back at the porch, water ran off the eaves in plain lines. I laid a towel on the floor and thought maybe repetition is how trust grows. Drip by drip, night by night. When the power returned, the lamp flickered and settled like a tired child. I wiped the kettle's lid with the edge of my sleeve and told myself the house and I had passed a small exam. At dawn, a truck door closed in the driveway. I braced for a clipboard. It wasn't a stranger. It was Diogo. He had the look of a man who'd been volunteered. "Larissa said you lost power," he said, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. I thought I'd check the lines down the road. He's good with wires and anything that pretends to be permanent. I let him come in because nothing in my hand said not to. He stood in the doorway looking at the new bench, the lamps, the kettle drying on the stove. "You made this into something?" he said, not quite ready to call it home. We walked the lane to where branches had bowed the line. He cleared what he could and flagged what he couldn't for the county. On the way back, he kicked a stone with the kind of frustration that looks for a smaller object. "I was wrong about the meeting," he said finally. About the line. "It's not just maps. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't not one." I poured him coffee, and we stood in the pause that comes before naming things. He picked up the flyer peeking out from under the kettle. "You going to their follow-up?" he asked. "If they drag that dotted line again," I said. He set the flyer down exactly where he found it, as if careful placement could count as respect. He left with a promise to fix the downed section when the county gave the okay. I watched the ridge swallow his taillights and felt the day tilt towards something less brittle. Then the mail carrier's SUV rattled up the lane and left me a certified envelope with a seal I didn't like. Inside, a notice gave me 30 days to cure title irregularities or face possible action. My hands went cold. The letter might as well have been a stone dropped in a bucket. It hit, and the water remembered how to move. I took the envelope to Miguel and laid it on the tailgate next to his measuring tape. He read it twice and didn't perform outrage. "It's a notice, not a verdict," he said. The county clerk's name sat near the bottom like a door you could knock on. We drove into town with the kettle packed in a towel because I wanted something I trusted in the truck. The clerk had a streak of blue in her hair and the kind of patience you wish on people with gavel jobs. She pulled up records and tapped through screens that stacked decades like firewood. "The chain is messy," she said, "but not broken. You need an affidavit of occupancy, a quiet title petition, and a surveyor's letter that the parcel's boundaries aren't argued by your neighbors." She slid a form toward me. "This is a list, not a cliff." I exhaled like air had been optional. "You can do this," she added, and I believed her because she sounded bored by drama and loyal to facts. I posted a note at the feed store asking for a surveyor who knew the ridge and didn't mind bad coffee. A man named Harris circled the number with a fingernail and called that afternoon. He had a voice like tire tread. "I'll be there Tuesday before the shade leaves your porch," he said. Meanwhile, I did what I could do in a day. I wrote the affidavit in my own hand because that's how my mother taught me to talk to paper. I printed photos of the porch with the date in the corner. I found 2 neighbors willing to sign that I live where I say I do, and that I'm not the kind to invent a roof. At night, when my brain wanted to rehearse disasters, I gave it chores. I hemmed a neighbor's work pants for the price of a bag of screws. I patched a quilt square that had been waiting since before Larissa learned to read. The kettle sounded like agreement each time it clicked off. On Tuesday, Harris walked the lines with a compass that looked older than his hat. He found corner pins under duff-like coins, flagged a curve I'd never noticed, and drew a map that matched the land, not the brochure. "You're fine," he said. "You're just not neat." He left me with a stamped letter that called the edges true. For the first time since the envelope, sleep felt like a place you arrive. I brought the affidavit, the photos, and Harris's letter to a small courtroom that smelled like old wood and coffee. The judge wore readers low on his nose and looked over them the way teachers do when they hope you studied. On one side, a woman from the development company looked like she chewed ice. On the other, an empty chair that belonged to any interested heir, which is a phrase that can ruin holidays. The judge asked straightforward questions. I answered with the kind of sentences that don't wobble. The company's lawyer tried to make the parcel sound like a corner of a bigger thought. The judge tapped Harris's letter with his pen and said, "Lines are lines." Larissa stood up from the back row and asked if she could speak as family. He let her. She didn't perform shame or sugar. She said I had been living there, repairing what existed, that the parcel isn't a shortcut. It's a home. Her voice did not tremble, which felt like a gift I couldn't have asked for. The judge sighed the way men who read paper all day sigh when they find an answer. "Quiet title granted pending filing," he said. "Easement denied. Curved trail acceptable if posted and maintained at the company's expense." The gavel tapped like an efficient handshake. The lawyer with the ice chewer face gathered her papers without huffing. Outside, Larissa hugged me with both arms, no clipboard between us. "I won't let anyone call your steps underutilized again," she said, and I believed her. On the way to the truck, we passed the company man from the first meeting. He gave me a nod that looked like a concession with pride intact. "We'll redraw," he said. "We'll keep off your porch." The road home felt shorter. The porch felt taller. I put the kettle on and watched the steam curl into a day that had decided to be kind. I thought we had turned the corner. That night, Larissa called to say she was late for dinner. and her voice had the thin edge it gets when there's a conversation she's not having at her own table. She came up alone with a paper bag and a confession folded inside her mouth. We sat at the table and she gave the words room. I was cruel at the door because I was drowning, she said, and the word felt right between us. Trying to get pregnant, failing, counting pills, counting days, hating how I counted. Diogo thinks the world is a set of problems that yields to systems. I wanted one night that wasn't a problem to solve. She looked at her hands. Then your flood arrived and I treated you like a system. I am sorry. My throat tightened and then loosened. I'm sorry I taught you to lead with logistics, I said. It's how I survived. I forgot to teach you the other half, to leave a chair pulled out, just in case. She laughed without meanness. You're better at metaphors than I am. No, I said. I'm better at kettles. On a Saturday near dusk, Miguel arrived with a gift that looked like a chore. A broken rocking chair he'd found at a sale, joints loose, one runner cracked clean through. Looks like work, I said. Looks like you, he answered, which I chose to take as the compliment it was. We set the chair on the porch and laid out sandpaper, glue, clamps. Larissa came the next morning with coffee and a notepad and wrote down the steps. Measure twice, cut once, she said, and we all laughed because some truths are fond of cliches. The chair took the glue the way dry wood takes rain, slowly at first, then with relief. I learned to leave the porch light on exactly 10 minutes after dark and not a minute more, long enough to welcome, not long enough to invite moths that don't know when to quit. I learned that the creak down the slope could be heard only when I wasn't trying to. I learned that sorrow, when given work and a place to wash its hands, becomes something you can carry without spilling. When the chair was finally dry, we tested it like examiners and fools one after the other, gentle at first and then with more faith. It rocked. It spoke the old language of houses that say yes without an audience. I set the kettle between us, and we drank our tea in the soft motion that makes conversations last longer than they would on flat chairs. I used to think the flood was the story, the daughter's door, the headline, the rest a footnote. Now I think the story is the long part after. The porch rails, the yellow tag, the meeting where paper held, the apology that did not make a ledger but made a path. I think the story is the way a key survives a tin, and a kettle survives a river, and a woman survives both and learns to call it living. If you stayed with me, tell me your city. I like to imagine the steam from this cup finding its way to your kitchen window, even for a second, and reminding you that ruin is not the opposite of home. It's the clearing where you learn how to build one. Days settled into a shape I could hold. Sweep, fix, phone calls, rest. The county office said utilities could be reactivated if I proved occupancy and safety. Words that sound simple until they lean on you. I made copies of the notarized letter, the storage receipt, the photo of the cabin's meter with today's date written on a slip of paper I held in the frame. I took a selfie on the porch because sometimes you have to put your own face in the evidence. I thought the paperwork would be the hardest part. I was wrong. A man in a crisp shirt knocked 2 mornings later, his truck door advertising a development company with a name meant to sound gentle. He carried a clipboard and the kind of smile that wants to buy what isn't for sale. He said the county planned to reassess holdings near the ridge and asked if I'd considered relocation support. I told him I had just relocated from a flooded house to a cabin with a roof that had decided to be kind. He looked past me like roofs were gossip. He left a brochure anyway. When his tires rattled away, the quiet felt like a held breath. Miguel arrived with a box of screws and a look that read the driveway like a page. He listened as I described the man and the words about reassess. He nodded the way builders do when they meet a problem they can measure. They've been sniffing around up here, he said. If anyone claims right-of-way across your steps, we'll answer with paper, not heat. He pulled a folded survey from his glove compartment and showed me orange tape still clinging to brush where lines had been walked last fall. You won't stand alone in a room, he said. Not for something that has your name on it. The county inspector came with a notebook and a careful voice. She checked the porch load, the stove clearance, the door swing, the breaker labels. You've done this right, she said, tapping the page with her pen. I just need one more thing. Proof you're repairing, not expanding. The ridge lots are a tangle. I handed her the notarized letter. She read the stamp, then my name, then the date, and said, This is cleaner than most. She signed her part and left me with a yellow tag I hung on a nail like a medal. Larissa texted that she would come again, this time alone and earlier. She arrived with paint samples the color of good intentions and a bag of groceries that had remembered blueberries. We sanded the porch rail and talked about ordinary things until the ordinary felt like an achievement. She asked about the man with the clipboard. I told her what he'd said. She went very quiet. "Diogo knows that firm," she said. "They're trying to bundle parcels for a trailhead. He thinks it'll raise values." She watched my face. "Do you want me to ask him to leave this alone?" "I want you to want me to stay," I said, and immediately wished I had chosen something less sharp. She didn't flinch. "I want you to stay," she said. Then, small, I also wanted to sleep that night. We both stood there with two truths in our hands and no decent pocket to put them in. We painted anyway. By the time the sun turned gold, the rail had a new skin, and our silence had learned a kinder shape. I thought the next hurdle would wait for business hours. It didn't. The development company posted a notice at the roadhead, an invitation to a public meeting to discuss community, access and safety improvements. I read it twice and heard the words that weren't printed. Access often means taking the shortest path through the place that is yours. Safety often means making things smooth for people who have never tripped where you tripped. I folded the flyer and slid it under the kettle like a promise. On the day of the meeting, I wore the winter coat that remembered my shoulders and carried a canvas bag with what my mother would call receipts. The notarized letter, the storage contract with its dates that predated anyone's brochure, the county yellow tag, and 4 photos with their times stamped in the corner. Miguel met me in the lot and handed me a thermos without comment. Inside, the room hummed with the heat of people who like microphones. A map stood on an easel at the front, parcel lines drawn in tidy candy colors that swallowed ridges and creeks like they were ideas, not places. The company man spoke first. He talked about connectivity, amenities, emergency response times. He used a phrase I have learned to mistrust. For everyone. He gestured with a capped marker at a dotted line that cut across land he called underutilized. The dotted line ran straight through my porch. They opened the floor. A neighbor in a camo jacket said trails were fine as long as trucks could still get through in winter. A mother with a baby on her shoulder asked for parking that wouldn't choke the 1-lane road. Then I stood, and every tired part of me stood with me. "I'm not against paths," I said. "I am against the idea that my home is the shortest distance between 2 other people's plans." I held up the letter and gave my name. I said the date twice. I laid the photos on the table, the yellow county tag on top, like a stack of cards I was willing to turn over one by one in any light. "I'm repairing what was mine to begin with," I said. "You don't need my steps to make something good." The room went very quiet in that way meetings do when they bump into a fact that won't move. The company man smiled like a man checking his pockets. He asked to review documentation with staff. Miguel stepped forward and said his full name and the name of his business, as if that called someone else into the room with us. He explained the survey tape, the corner pins, the difference between a path people use and an easement that exists. He didn't flex. He measured. It landed. Afterward, in the corridor that smells like waxed floors and old decisions, the company man lowered his voice. "We can curve the line," he said, practical at last. "We don't need your steps." I nodded and didn't shake his hand because I was using mine to hold the thermos. I walked into the cool evening and felt a piece of the day click into place like a well-cut joint. Larissa called when I was halfway home. "Diogo heard the lines moving," she said. "He says that's a win." The way she said win made me hate the word a little less. "Mom," she added, "will you send me the letter? I want a copy." It was the first time she had asked for a piece of my history that wasn't a recipe. At the cabin, the porch smelled faintly of new paint and soft wood warming after a cool day. I set the kettle to boil and spread the papers on the table to breathe. Miguel looked at them and at me the way a foreman looks at a beam that has agreed to load. "You handled that," he said. "With facts." He poured tea into 2 chipped cups and we sat on the new bench in a silence that felt like a room holding. I thought peace would keep until morning. I was wrong. At 9, my phone lit with a message from the insurance company changing the estimate downward because a satellite photo suggested pre-existing wear. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because you can either laugh or let paper do your crying. I wrote back with photos of the floodline taken the night of the alert and copies of maintenance receipts I found in the trunk, oil-stained slips with Harold's neat handwriting, dates clear as bells. Proof is sometimes ugly. It works anyway. For the first time since the water, I slept through. Morning carried a small pride. I made tea and wrote a list that looked like progress. Seal porch rail, clear needle traps near downspouts, county office to record letter, ask neighbor about snowplow. The kettle clicked off and I realized I wanted to share a small thing with Larissa. Nothing heavy, just the way the steam looked in the slant of light. I sent her a photo of the cup and the caption, "First morning it tasted like home." She replied with a picture of her own mug on a spotless counter. Then another message. "Can I come next Wednesday after work?" Alone. I answered yes before the part of me that hoards safety could make a speech. Wednesday, the road cooperated. She arrived with a tote bag of practical gifts. Batteries, a flashlight you could land a plane with, hand cream for hands that have remembered tools. We sat at the table, and for once her questions were not an audit. "I've been seeing someone," she said suddenly, then laughed at herself. "Not like that." "A counselor. She says I lead with logistics because I'm afraid of mess." She bit the inside of her cheek. "I'm sorry I made you feel like a mess." "I am a mess," I said, smiling. "I'm just not refuse." She took a breath that looked like a peel coming off a fruit. "Can we start coming up on Sundays? I can help you inventory, and you can teach me the way you mend seams that don't show." The way she said we told me she meant it. I nodded and put the kettle on again because sometimes the best answer is hot and repeatable. The man in the crisp shirt did not return. The county clerk mailed me a stamped copy of the recorded letter with a sticky note that said, "You're squared away." The insurance adjusted back upward after I sent proof, plus an email from my neighbor who had photos from the same night. I made a folder called Keep and one called Don't Try Me Again. The cabin learned our footsteps. The door stopped complaining. The porch became a place where time liked to linger. At 2:14 a.m., my phone lit up. Emergency alert, immediate evacuation. I was barefoot in the kitchen. The kettle had just begun to sing. In 20 minutes, the water crossed my threshold and kept my keys. I grabbed one folder, my mother's sewing tin, and the blue kettle that still smelled like home. I drove toward the high school lot they called dry. It wasn't. It was just less wet. I called my daughter. "Come here," she said. Relief spread through me like warmth after cold. Her neighborhood looked untouched. I carried 3 bags and the kettle to her door. She opened to a slice of hallway light and said, "Mom, we decided this won't work. Try a hotel. No anger. Just a decision already signed." I nodded because sometimes silence is the only coat that fits. Stay with me to the end. "Then tell me which city you're listening from." I slept in the car. Not from bravery. Rooms after midnight cost more than I had. By morning, a gas station mirror showed a face that had missed a night and a life. I bought coffee to make standing legal and didn't look myself in the eye. At 10:22, the subject line arrived. Claim update, total loss. Inside, depreciation, deductible, 30 to 45 days. Numbers marching in a straight line toward a place I couldn't live. I thought the worst part had passed. I was wrong. That night I tried a church parking lot. A man in a yellow cap tapped my window. "You lost?" he asked. "Just tired," I said. "Aren't we all?" he answered, and left me the quiet that follows a kind truth. I told myself not to think about old promises. I keep names I swore I'd forget in the same drawer as spare keys. On the 3rd morning, I opened my mother's green tin. Beneath buttons and a coil of elastic lay a small brass key with a violin-shaped bow and a storage receipt in my younger handwriting. Under that, a softened business card, a first name in faded blue, a number with an area code I hadn't dialed in years. I felt my hands go steady the way hands do when they remember. I called. It rang twice. "This is Miguel," the voice said. Older timber, same ground. I told him about 214, about the door, about try a hotel, about the car that had become a room. "Text me where you are," he said. I started to argue. He said my name once, like a rope thrown clean. "Come with me." He found me by the sound a good engine makes. He didn't inventory my shame. He lifted the kettle like it mattered. We drove to the storage place, a row of sun-faded doors, each with a dent that proved a life had happened there. The key turned as if metal could remember metal. Inside, a trunk with a brave leather handle, one box labeled kitchen in a hopeful curve, a manila envelope that had outlived its glue. The trunk held a quilt stitched from dresses, a cigar box with 3 coins and a Polaroid full of bad haircuts, and a notarized letter that read like permission: take possession and maintain until transfer or sale. Taxes paid through a year that wasn't yesterday. A door that wasn't pretty, but it opened. The wardrobe box offered mercy disguised as ordinary. A winter coat that remembered shoulders. Boots that wanted work, 2 plates, a saucepan with a dent you could trust, a wooden spoon with a burn mark like a map. I pressed my thumb where the 1/3 line had faded on the measuring cup, and thought about how we keep the world fair by dividing it into parts we can manage. We took what matters now and what will matter next week. The kettle, of course, the folder and the letter, the coat, the blanket, the saucepan, the spoon, 2 books that can be reread without apology. I tied the letters back with their tired ribbon. Some floodlines you choose yourself. The cabin sat 2 hours up a road that remembered curves. Cedar shingles silvered by weather, a porch with 1 missing baluster, a door still politely green beneath the blisters. The lock turned. The room smelled like dust and old rain. We opened the shutters, and the light didn't hesitate. The well cap was where the note said it was. The propane valve argued and then cooperated. The breaker clicked up, and the old refrigerator answered like a friend who still picks up. I swept while Miguel read the roof from the ground. The house didn't promise more than it could keep. That felt like respect. We ate bread, an apple that had waited too long, and tuna that tasted better than the label suggested. "I'm angry," I said. Not at water doesn't choose. At the sentence at that door. At being this age and learning which thresholds only open one way. "You still measure," he said. "That's a skill." We slept on folded blankets and history. Night in the trees spoke in a tongue that didn't need witnesses. I woke 3 times reaching for a car ceiling and found beams that knew their maker. Morning came like a reasonable employer, on time, ready to work. The first boil in a new place tastes like the decision that preceded it. The kettle sang. Steam found my face. Something inside me exhaled. Miguel brought a mattress, a tall broom for roof needles, 2 lamps that minded their business. He set hinges right. I washed the floor. By afternoon, the cabin had crossed from structure to shelter. I called my daughter. I told her I was safe and had a place with paper to back it. She offered groceries, relief attaching itself to the task. Guessing a mother's coffee is a kind of love. Saturday, she came with milk, rice, soap, and a brand I probably wouldn't have chosen. We laughed about the roof's potential leak, which is another way to say we were both hopeful and cautious. We made tea. She looked at the kettle and her face softened without asking permission. "I'm sorry about that night," she said, like someone apologizing for a bruise she didn't mean to cause. "It was late." "It was," I said. We stood in a room that had decided to keep us and practiced a smaller, truer way of being family. The insurance followed with lists: covered, not covered, sentimental, therefore irrelevant. I smiled at the word. If you can't price it, it's probably the part that kept you alive. 2 of Miguel's men came on a favor and turned a missing baluster into a bench. By evening, the door hung true, the roof breathed easier, and I could put a list on the table without it sliding off. County office, utility reactivation, used rocking chair, a plant that forgives beginners. At the top I wrote, "Keep the door open while it's safe. Lock it when you sleep. Finish the part you can finish. I used to think home was where your furniture knew your shins. Now I think it's where a kettle can sing and someone says, 'Come with me,' and means it. If you've listened this far, tell me your city. I like to know where a story finds a light to sit under."